So I want to talk a little bit about Karuna tonight. One of the psychological benefits of working with Karuna is that it helps us see some of the pattern reactions we have to our own suffering and the suffering of others. I talked about some of the resistances to suffering. That enjoyment of another's suffering, cruelty, and then what can appear similar, pity, righteous anger, so anger at their loss, and fear. And the fear is really a reaction to the presence of suffering, a kind of concern that we're going to get it. It's going to be catchy somehow. And not knowing, how bad their suffering is or what to do about it, we can feel sort of paralyzed with fear. And again, this is where any of these reactions we have, indifference or others, we want to first start with upekkha, with acceptance. This is what's here. When we try to avoid or minimize what's happening or pretend what's happening, we're not able to work with it because we're not authentically meeting the situation. This is why upekkha is so critical. And then we can also have a certain amount of openness to our own suffering, that we're suffering because we're witnessing somebody else's difficulties. And that opens us up to the compassion of the Absolute, which can help us to meet the suffering. And we can also respond, as I mentioned, with indifference. We can feel that we're slightly above the other's suffering, their difficulty, their struggles, and can really not feel like we want to be bothered by it. And we learn this if you spend much time in big cities. It's one of the things you learn because you're around such suffering of homeless people and people in difficulties, different addictions and such. And it seems to be how we protect ourselves a bit is with the cloud of indifference. But we're really leaning and learning more into how to open to suffering. When we meet suffering, rather than to close, to open and to see what's here. The other issue we can have with response to suffering is there can be a tendency to overconnect with the person that's suffering, to want to rescue them, want to fix them, make them better. And based on our own family history, there can be a tendency to overmerge, to overconnect with the other. And that starts leading into some of the codependent behavior where our happiness depends on them working through this suffering successfully. And we're going to do everything we can, controlling them, to make them resolve this suffering in a way that we think they should. The indifference can come from birth families when there was a lot of callousness to suffering, a lot of minimization, a lot of shaming when someone was suffering. And so kids will often learn to suffer in silence, in solo suffering, go off on their own, because there's no one there to hear it. And so that can really cultivate that indifference. And the birth family issues around merger, if we had a parent who was really clingy, really needy, who needed us as the child to fulfill them, they very well may have overmerged. There's a time of child development that's called rapprochement. Actually, the French is something like, well, someone here could probably say that than I can. But anyway, it's called rapprochement in American English. And it's a time when the child is beginning to separate from caregiver. And you'll see this in a park. You'll see a little 2 or 3 year old coming to the caregiver, holding on, wanting stuff, and then running off to be with other kids or other activities. And they never quite get out of eyesight of the caregiver. And they keep looking back, making sure they're still there. The connection is there. I can be over here, but I know that base is over there. And the child will run back and connect again with the caregiver. Back home again, everything's fine. And the next step of rapprochement is where the child will actually get out of sight of the caregiver, will go around a corner behind a building or structure, and come out and take a look, make sure that caregiver is still present, and then go off and play. And this is how the child begins to individuate. But if the caregiver is one who can't let the child individuate, if the caregiver is needy enough, they will not let the child get out of their sight. In my family, my father was the second born in a family where his eldest sister died as an infant. And it was told to my grandmother to carry him for the first 2 years of his life. She wouldn't put him down. I mean, I don't know what psychologically that did to him, but the point was she was so overmerging because of her grief and her suffering that she didn't want anything to happen to him. But it affected him, and he was a very independent person and really pushed people away, I think because of how much he held on. So it really does impact the way people learn how to relate to others by how they get treated as children. In my teaching, I talk a lot about birth family issues and effects because that's the pattern we all learn. And the reason it's so important in the spiritual life is because we project that onto the absolute. That's what we expect, how we expect it to work. And that's part of the unlearning we have to do along the way. And the Brahmaviharas are one of the best ways to do that, to see our habituated responses, to evaluate them in the lens of truth, and to try and be more and more authentic in how we meet them and how we respond. I want to talk a little bit about how, at least my view of how the self forms, our sense of self. And there's a lot of theories in psychology about this. There's one that I particularly like. I find it fits with my view of my own life and working with students now for nearly 20 years. And it comes from a theory proposed by Margaret Mahler called dual unity. And in this theory, the infant is born into a dual unity. The infant does not know that it is a separate being. If you've ever held a newborn, or if you've held a newborn, you can feel there's just an instant oneness, a unity with that infant. They don't know how to differentiate. And if you're sensitive enough, you'll feel it. You'll enter into that unity with them. And to them, that feels normal. Their unity is with the absolute, with presence and with love. That's how they're born, in undividedness. And for each of us, we all were born this way and lived our very early life in connection with our source. But at some point, as we began to become aware, we began to realize all the need was inside. The need for a clean diaper, for food, for attention, affection was all inside. And the resolution, the solution was all outside. It was all the caregivers. And so a couple of things happen when the infant realizes this. First, it activates a survival instinct. The baby realizes that I'm not going to survive if I don't get these people to take care of me, to connect with me. And the baby also begins to get a sense that I'm what's inside the skin. This is where the body boundary identity starts. If this skin gets hurt or this body gets hurt, I feel pain. So this must be me, and that must be other. And so that starts the relationship of the body boundary and understanding ourselves as a very simple identity. And in the course of establishing the body boundary as self, the survival instinct and the need of the caregivers, we turn away from the absolute. We turn away from the presence and love. We get that we can't stay connected, and we can't stay connected simultaneously to the caregivers. And so we all turn away. And really interestingly, virtually all of us blame ourselves. It's my fault. Something was wrong with me. I must be damaged in some way. And this starts what I call the core wound. And that's that deep part that people feel deep in their gut, the churning of I'm not good enough. I'm worthless. I'm helpless. I'm unlovable. I'm bad. I'm helpless, hopeless, worthless. There's some combination. And we take that on. That becomes a core identity. And as we develop, we begin to structure a personality. We start sort of stacking all the things we're good at, building the scaffolding on top of the core wound. And the personality, in my view, is chiefly responsible for convincing people we're not the wound. Don't look here, look here. Look at all I can do. And so this begins that shift. And at the same time, it activates what I call the longing heart. And this is the deep drive to want to return. We want to return to that union with the absolute and with love and presence. We don't know how to do that, but we want it. And what we start seeing in our world around us, in our birth family and through entertainment, is that there is stuff people can get that makes them feel good. And so possessions, relationships, careers, education, all these things people can long for that they think is going to fill them. I mean, we've all done this. Well, as soon as I get this degree, as soon as I get this partner or have this stage of life, everything is going to be great. I'm going to feel good. And of course, it happens and it does. We do feel good momentarily, but then it fades and we're back feeling that core wound. The only way that we can ever work the core wound or satisfy the longing heart is through spiritual practice. It's the only place we can connect to the absolute directly and reestablish this relationship, renew it. It's the only way that we can begin to fill in the core wound. And we do it by monitoring our behavior, as you're doing here, noticing suffering, noticing reactions to suffering. That's all a part of this. And then as we begin to work personality material, a lot of my students, I have them keeping an eye out for overreactions in their life, places where their reaction was way stronger than it should have been. That's usually a tip off that some core issue is being disturbed. Some self-beliefs, part of the core wound, something is being triggered by the events of life. And so when they have that overreaction, we explore it together. What happened? What does it remind you of? What was it like in your birth family around this kind of issue? And we usually can find an early memory of some dynamic like this. There was one, I've used this as an example many times, but a student who got a glass of water, I think, in a restaurant with a big fat lipstick mark on it. And rather than simply ask the server for a fresh glass, they erupted in anger at the server. And they realized afterwards, and that was way, way over the top. This was totally unwarranted. And we began working this issue. Okay, well, what did you feel right before the anger? And that's always the important place to look. Before that reaction of anger or outburst, there's something happening. And so what they began to feel was fear. I felt afraid when I saw the lipstick on the glass. Why would you feel afraid about that? Well, it made me feel like I wasn't being seen. I was invisible to them. They didn't care. And so they gave me anything with dirty glass. So it was a value judgment about them is how they took it. So we found some early memory and worked through that. And they were able to see the pattern that was established and activated. And once they go through that enough times, then I have them go back as they are today and replay the memory and be that, that 5-year-old, but with today's experience. And typically the reaction is very different. And that begins to change the sequence of memories that follow that feeling invisible, that fear. And it begins, anytime we change the memories in ways we hold ourselves, we change our self-identity. We're rewriting who we are. And so this is how we continuously upgrade who we are as a person, our personality, all of that. And this is the evolution of spiritual practice. For students of mine that have had an awakening experience, Kensho just becomes critical to work because there's this realization of something that's transcends personality, and then there's the personality workings. There's the absolute and there's the mundane, trying to interface and fit, and they don't at first. So we have to work to unwind the personality patterns that aren't in conformity with the realization. And that helps the realization land more deeply, and it opens them to later awakenings. So it's part of the process. So anyway, this is sort of the evolution that I see in terms of how self-identity gets started. There's a lot more complexity because there's all this different input. And in addition, there's social input we take on from our societies, from different groups we're in, the world and the time that we live in too. So there's a lot to work with in doing this kind of work. But this is where it starts with the Brahmaviharas, that we start by making contact, learning things like upekkha, acceptance, learning to meet suffering. Later in the retreat, we'll work also with mudita, which is empathetic joy. And to me, I see our spiritual practices, when we meet a situation, we meet it first with upekkha, with acceptance. And then based upon whether we're meeting suffering or we're meeting joy, that's the fork in the road on whether we turn towards Karuna or mudita. And then ultimately, in the Brahmaviharas, we then come to metta, which is unconditioned love. And that's sort of the crown of all Brahmaviharas. That's the source. That's the pure love that we were in contact with in the guided meditation. That's metta. And so it all filters down, and we work these different issues around different of the Brahmaviharas, again, changing who we are, how we react to things, and hopefully continuing to upgrade our software and sense of self as we do this. I wanted to talk a little bit also tonight about the Four Noble Truths. Many of you know these. These are a foundational teaching in Buddhism. The way the Buddha's life is presented, as I've read it, is that after his great awakening, and before I talk about that as awakening, the Buddha pursued the path of what we now know as Theravada Buddhism as soon as he abandoned palace life. He did the practices, many of the practices we're doing, many of the practices I teach. He did as a gradual deconstruction of the self and a deepening connection with the source, with the absolute. But it wasn't until his great awakening that the absolute woke up to itself in his experience, in his consciousness. And after that, he went through a period of a few days trying to decide whether he wanted to simply stay in this great bliss or if he would try to begin to teach. And he decided he wanted to teach. or that it was the right thing to do. And so one of the first teachings was the Four Noble Truths. I'll just go through these briefly. The first noble truth is dukkha, is suffering or chronic unsatisfactoriness. And this is that business about not getting exactly what we want exactly when we want it, or getting less than we want, or losing what we want. But the main point of dukkha is that anything conditioned is going to lead to suffering. Anything conditioned is going to decay and eventually disintegrate and die. And so inherently, it's going to be a temporary pleasure. In my experience teaching, having dukkha, having suffering it's not the worst of the suffering we encounter. It's typically the judgment that we have about our suffering that causes the most pain. So our resistance, our avoidance to feeling our own suffering, our finding distractions is what causes more pain. The Buddha talked about this as the second arrow. The first arrow is the suffering itself. The second arrow is the commentary and judgment and the story about the first arrow. And that's often, as I mentioned, more painful. The second noble truth in Pali is called samudaya. Conditioned reality coupled with dukkha results in craving. So this is where we start craving all we can find in the dualistic world to satisfy this hunger, this suffering, this craving. We look for all the places that are going to fill us. But ultimately, they all can only temporarily satisfy us. The only way that we can resolve suffering, the only way that we can really drop the suffering of the self-identity in Theravada Buddhism is through what's called Nirodha, which is the experience of cessation. Cessation is an experience that we can have meditatively. It requires us journeying into the unmanifest absolute, into the blackness, into the peace and stillness, deep into the absence, to the extent that all thought stops. We're then left with a sense of individual consciousness and awareness. And as we go deeper towards cessation, deeper into the peacefulness and stillness, then individual consciousness begins to flicker and go out. It turns off. And we're left with pure awareness, which is direct awareness, awareness by contact. And as we go deeper still into the peacefulness and stillness, into the black absence, then awareness begins to flicker and that goes out. And that's the experience of cessation. Cessation is ceasing of all mentality and all materiality. And the reason that cessation is challenging for people is because we understand very clearly as we approach cessation that I must say yes to enter. I have to come in affirmatively, and I don't know how to exit. I don't have any idea how to exit. And so it feels to us like it's going to be a death. That's why people resist when they get to the cusp of cessation. I did a retreat last year on cessation and did guided meditations up to what I call the portal of cessation. And I coined a phrase from that retreat that there was a cessation waiting room. Because people would get up there and the languaging and the sense of self would be gone, consciousness and awareness would be there, and they'd stay. And they'd just hang out. And it's still useful because you can feel cessation from the waiting room. And you start getting a sense of it, and it develops a certain trust of letting go. But it's what we have to do. And so I came up with this expression, the trust bank, that whenever we have new experience and nothing bad happens, we need to put that experience in the trust bank. We need to know I can go to the end of this carpet. I've been there before. Nothing bad happened. The next step, I have no idea. Maybe I'll fall off the earth, but I know this is safe. And so we just build this trust sort of step by step until at some point we can let go. Interestingly, the cessation, my observation is that unless the cessation experience lasts a minimum of 30 minutes, there isn't significant change. From 30 minutes on, it's very different. I use the example, it's like going on vacation and returning to find all the furniture is rearranged in your house. Your internal structuring changes from a deep experience of cessation. That's why it's such an important experience in Theravada Buddhism. And so finally we come to the fourth noble truth, Marga, which means path. And this is developing and cultivating what we call the Eightfold Path, with the eye of unity, the eye of the unborn, the uncreated, the absolute. And just briefly going through these, the first is right view. And this is the view from the absolute, the view from the unborn, the unconditioned. It's understanding the truth of dukkha. We need dukkha in order to practice. It's what drives us to practice. The second is right resolve, the resolve to turn towards ultimate truth and live from our clearest understanding and depth. The third is right speech, using speech that's unifying, not divisive, saying what's true, avoiding gossip, idle or unnecessary speech. The fourth is right action, to act from our clear knowing of the absolute, having that be primary, living from the non-duality, the unity of the absolute. Right livelihood, engaging in work that promotes unity, clarity of understanding, and honors all life as an expression of the absolute. Right effort, not using our doing energy, not accomplishing, but rather using the clarity of being, our clarity of being, to navigate life and to decide and to select what is the appropriate effort to use. You're doing this here in the meditation retreat. You're finding the right effort to apply to the meditation. It's not always a doing energy. We may start with a doing energy, but it has to relax fairly quickly for the meditation to develop. The seventh of the Eightfold Path is right awareness, strong awareness from our deepest truth, rather than our conventional dualistic mind. A willingness to perceive and be aware from the unified, unconditioned mind, the absolute. And then finally, the eighth of the Eightfold Path is right samadhi, developing and using the concentration meditation, breath awareness, or heart practices in particular, to sharpen and focus awareness, to penetrate conventional perspectives and see what is objective, universal, and an action of the absolute. So this is our charge as Buddhists, to continue on this path, to build our relationship with the absolute as we appropriately question and challenge habituated mind states and patterns of behavior. We learn to be better in our lives, and that's what we're doing here. So all of this is working, seen and unseen, through this retreat, and bringing us back to the Brahmaviharas as one of the entry points for this deep practice.